computer science geeks. Today we are going to cover constructors, but not just any constructor, something better than that. We're going to cover super constructors. All right, before we get there, we have to remember what we've learned in the past. We learned the super keyword in the previous lesson. We use the super keyword to call methods in the superclass. So for example, right down here, I can call the superclass and get a value from it, but if I want to get a cooler value than that, I can add 3 in my class. That's an example of using the super keyword. You know what's kind of funny here is that super keyword kind of reminds me a little bit of this, but it's actually your superclass is this. Your superclass as of this, it's called super. Yeah. Confusing yet? All right, let's keep going. I don't care. What are we going to do today? Today I'm going to show you how the compiler calls the superclass constructor, okay? Imagine that we want to give employees more vacation days than the longer they've been with the company. What are you talking about, Mr. Stride? Well, it has to do with the fact that I've been working with this lawyer firm and employees with lawyers and secretaries and legal secretaries and stuff. So let's just say that for each year worked, we want to give everyone in this firm 2 additional vacation days. So this is what we need to do. When an employee object is constructed, we're going to pass in the number of years that the person has been with the company, and that way we'll be able to calculate how many vacation days they deserve. So what we're going to have to do in order to make this work is we're going to have to modify our class, our employee class, and add some new both state and behavior, okay? So I want you to do this exercise. I want you to make the necessary modifications to the employee class. All right, here we go. We got this employee class. What we did was we added this instance field. We've added some new state to this employee class. I've added the number of years that they've been with this company. And then I changed the constructor. So the employer constructor now takes a parameter. It is the initial years that they've been with this company. And then what I'll do is I'm going to take that initial years value and add it into my instance field years. I could have had this be called years, and then I could have done this dot years, but in this case I just kept them separate. Then what I did is that I go to the vacation days, and I've updated that to do 10 days plus 2 times the number of years that we're having a class. Pretty cool, right? Bam! You know what happens if you try to compile this? It won't compile. Well, this class will compile. But what happens is your subclasses no longer compile. Why? We need to find out. Why won't it compile? All right, so here's what happens. When we add or change the employee constructor, what we did was not only did we add a constructor, but we eliminated a constructor. There used to be a constructor there for us so we didn't see. It was called the default constructor. As soon as we provide one, then what happens is that the default constructor doesn't exist anymore. You're like, so what? Why can't the default constructor for lawyer still work? I don't get it. Well, because the default constructor for the lawyer class will look like this. It will have public lawyer, and then it has one line in it. One line, it does super, okay? So the very first line of a constructor from a subclass will call its super constructor. And this is how it's done. You don't see this, and you don't have to put it there, but no matter what, if you don't type it in, the compiler is going to add one line at the top of your subclass's constructor called super. So this is how it works. This is super. Just a keyword. It's just like this. It can be used to call a constructor, and we can add parameters into it. So what we would do to fix our lawyer class and all the other subclasses that directly inherit from employer is to create the constructor that takes the number of years. Then we call super years. So it's not just the employee class that gets a new constructor, but all the subclasses need to. This is kind of lame, right? You're thinking, wait a minute, I thought inheritance was supposed to reduce the amount of work that we needed to do. But when we create a subclass that calls the superclass's constructor, we need to make sure that there are constructors that work. We can't just have a lawyer that has no years of employment, at least not unintentionally. We could do it intentionally if we wanted to. So we have to explicitly call out the lawyer constructor. We could have said we could have added our own parameterless constructor that does 0 and pass in 0, but in either way, we have to create a constructor here. Now, notice that in this case, the only line is the super constructor. If you have other lines in your constructor, you need to make sure that the call to the super is the very first line. So let's go to our marketer. We go into our marketer, we make a new constructor there. We just call the super with the number of years we want to do. And then we go ahead and we've already updated the salary to work correctly there. What I want you to do is I want you to modify the secretary subclass so that first, secretary's years of employment are not tracked. Okay, we're not going to track the secretary's years. They don't get extra vacation days, no matter how long they've worked. All right, so this is how we do it. We create a parameterless constructor, secretary, that has no parameters. Then we still have to explicitly call super with 0 because we did not have a parameter inside of our employee class with the 0. We did not have a parameterless constructor inside of our employee because when we created the constructor, we eliminated the default constructor, which is one with no parameters. So this is how we fixed it here. How else could we have done it? Did you figure it out? We also could have gone into the employee class and added a new constructor, explicitly typing out the constructor that has 0 parameters, and then when it takes 0 parameters, we just simply set years equal to 0. Now that could have fixed our situation across the board, but by adding that, we're kind of allowing the back door for the subclasses to create instances of themselves without really giving much thought about the number of years of employment. In this case, what we're saying is that only the secretary class can be created with years equal to 0. Since our secretary does not require any parameters to a constructor, the legal secretary compiles without a constructor. What? Say that again, Mr. Stride. You're talking nonsense. Okay, remember there's a legal secretary class that inherits from the secretary? That legal secretary must also call its super constructor. When it calls super, it will be by default call the one with no parameters. We created right here a constructor in the secretary class that takes no parameters. So our legal secretary won't have to change at all, okay? Because its default constructor will call the secretary with no parameters. So you don't need to do anything to the legal secretary class. Now what I want you to do, from memory, I want you to type in the code, okay, or you write it down, for what the child default constructor will look like. All right, the default constructor will be a single line. It'll take no parameters and it'll call the superclass constructor. Here's what we need to remember. Every constructor will call the super constructor. If you're a subclass, you're going to call the superclass's constructor. And if you don't explicitly create a constructor, the Java compiler will create a default constructor. And in that default constructor will be one line, and that is super paren paren. So it will call the super constructor if you don't provide one. All right, so we've reviewed constructors. I want you to think about this class. Just look at it. I want you to think about what can we learn just by looking at this code. And I don't want you to just say, hey, WileEcoyote extends Coyote. That makes sense. Yeah, it's right there. Oh, and then we have a parameter or a no parameter constructor here. I want you to infer other information, such as that since we're calling a super with a parameter, we can infer that Coyote has a constructor that takes one parameter, most likely the name. Also down here, we can see that we do super.genius. So we could have extended a method, genius, and put that in WileEcoyote only, but Since we are calling super.genius, then we can infer that the Coyote class also has a method called genius. Genius. All right, what did we learn? I've said it probably twice. I'm going to say it again. This is important. Every constructor will call the super constructor, okay? It's just going to happen. If you don't type it in, it's the first line there. Even if you explicitly create a constructor and you don't type in super on the first line, the compiler will put super there for you. If you don't have any constructor at all, the compiler will create a constructor, and the one and only line will be a call to the super constructor. Now I leave you with...
Permit me to introduce myself. My name is Coyote. WileEcoyote. Genius.
Have brain, eh? Hey, that must be very handy at times.